The crash in the woods, it was a cold and silent night, and the sky was full of stars, and the sound of insects filled the forest near the small town of Ember Ridge, and a man named Ray was working late in his garage, and his hands were dirty with oil, and his old radio kept playing strange static sounds that were not normal, and Ray looked up from his work when the radio gave a sharp burst of high-pitched noise, and the lights flickered once, and then all at once, the whole garage shook. Ray stepped outside and looked at the sky, and his heart began to race when he saw a bright light moving fast above the trees, and it was not like a plane, and it was not like a shooting star, and it was moving in a strange zigzag motion, and the light grew brighter, and then it disappeared behind the trees with a loud crashing sound, and the earth under Ray's feet trembled, and a small fire glow rose in the distance. Without thinking, Ray grabbed his flashlight and keys and jumped into his old pickup truck, and the engine roared as he drove toward the place where the light had fallen, and he felt nervous and excited at the same time. And as he reached the edge of the forest, he saw smoke rising above the trees and orange light flashing like fire. Ray walked carefully through the trees and followed the broken branches and burnt leaves, and the ground was warm under his boots, and the air smelled like metal and smoke. And then he saw a strange silver object was lying between the trees, and it was broken and twisted and half buried in the earth, and blue lights blinked weakly from its sides, and steam hissed from cracks and holes, and it was not like anything Ray had seen before, and his hands shook as he stepped closer inside the wreck. Ray saw something that made his heart freeze, and two small shapes were lying near the back of the ship, and they were moving slightly and making soft sounds like crying, and they looked like babies but not fully human, and their skin had a faint silver shine, and their eyes glowed softly even in the dark, and their heads had tiny ridges like crowns. Ray stood frozen for a moment, and then something inside him moved, and he rushed forward and picked them up one by one, and they were warm and alive and scared, and they stopped crying when they felt his arms around them. And Ray looked around and found a small blinking device lying next to them, and he picked it up and put it in his pocket without understanding what it was. He ran back to his truck carrying both children wrapped in his jacket, and drove back home through the night, and his heart was still racing, and his mind was full of questions and fear and wonder, and he had no idea what to do. But he knew one thing, and that was he could not leave them behind, and he would not let them get hurt. At home he cleaned a small room and laid them gently on a blanket and gave them warm milk, and they drank slowly and looked up at him with big glowing eyes, and their hands reached for his fingers, and he smiled for the first time that night, and something in his heart told him that they were special and innocent, and they needed him. He looked at the blinking device again and noticed a strange symbol on its surface, and it looked like a crown with two stars, and he did not understand what it meant, but it felt important, and he placed it in a drawer and covered it with a cloth. Far above the earth on a dark ship floating in space, a signal came alive, and a voice spoke in a cold and deep tone, and it said, "The royal heirs have survived. Begin the hunt." And strange alien figures looked at a glowing screen that showed a small forest on Earth and a small blinking dot moving away from the crash site, and they did not speak, but their eyes burned with hunger and purpose. Back on Earth, Ray sat near the two children as they slept peacefully, and he did not know that a storm was coming, and that he had just become part of something much bigger than he could imagine. And he looked at the stars through his window and whispered softly, "Who are you, little ones? And where did you come from? And what happens now?" The morning came with soft light shining through the windows, and Ray stood in the kitchen holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold in his hand, and his eyes kept going to the small room where the two strange children were still asleep, and their silver skin shimmered softly in the light, and their breathing was calm and steady like any human baby, and yet everything about them felt different and unreal. He sat down at the table and looked at the device again, and the strange symbol on it seemed more detailed now, like it had shifted slightly in the night, and it was no ordinary machine, and it pulsed gently with a blue light, and when Ray touched it, he felt a soft hum go through his fingers, and suddenly a small hologram appeared in the air. Above it showed a tall figure with a crown standing in a large hall filled with strange creatures, and behind the figure stood two smaller figures that looked like the children, and the tall figure raised a hand, and a wave of golden light surrounded the two small ones, and the image vanished quickly, and the device stopped glowing, and Ray sat frozen with the image burned into his mind. He knew now that these children were not just from another world, but from some kind of royal family, and something terrible must have happened for them to be sent to Earth like that, and he began to wonder if someone was looking for them, and if they were in danger even now. He turned on his old computer and began searching the internet for anything related to strange symbols or recent satellite crashes, and most of the results were useless. But one small article caught his eye, and it was from a local news blog talking about a meteor crash near Ember Ridge, and a few witnesses had reported strange lights in the sky and government vehicles seen in the area later at night. Ray felt a chill go down his spine as he read the last line, which said that officials had closed off a section of the forest for investigation, and he knew then that he had to keep the children hidden and safe. And he went to the small room and gently picked them up and held them close and whispered that he would not let anyone take them. Over the next few days, Ray made changes to his home and covered the windows and installed locks and cameras and made the basement into a safer place with food blankets and toys, and the children began to smile more and laugh softly when he played with them, and they responded to his voice with small words that sounded like music. One evening, while cleaning the device again, Ray accidentally pressed a hidden panel, and a second message appeared in the air, and this time it was not an image, but a voice speaking in a strange language, and yet somehow Ray could understand it like it was being translated in his mind, and the voice said, "This message is for those who find the royal heirs of Thaler, and they must be protected at all cost, and if they fall into enemy hands, the kingdom will be lost forever." Ray felt the weight of those words settle on his shoulders, and he realized that he was no longer just a mechanic in a small town, but the protector of something much bigger than he had ever imagined. And he looked at the twins, who were now sitting quietly and looking back at him with eyes full of trust and hope. Meanwhile, far across space, a dark ship moved silently through the stars, and its leader stood before a massive screen showing Earth and a red marker blinking over the forest near Ember Ridge, and a deep voice echoed through the chamber, saying, "The signal is active, the heirs are alive, and the search must begin now." And rows of armored soldiers stepped forward and bowed before receiving orders, and within seconds, small scout ships launched toward Earth like shadows in the night. Ray felt uneasy as he stepped outside to get supplies from town, and he noticed a black van parked near the gas station, and two men in suits standing nearby pretending to look at a map, and their eyes followed him quietly, and something about them felt wrong and cold, and he quickly turned back and drove home without stopping. That night he could not sleep, and he sat near the twins holding a small flashlight and listening to every sound outside, and the wind howled and trees creaked and every shadow looked like danger, and yet deep inside him something stronger began to grow, and it was not just fear anymore, but something like courage. He whispered to the twins that no matter what happens, he would protect them, and he would find out who they were and where they came from and why they were sent here and what it all meant, and he knew the answers were out there waiting, and he would not stop until he found the truth. The wind was strong, and the sky was dark as a strange object moved silently above the clouds, and no one saw it, and no radar tracked it, and it was not alone, and behind it flew two more dark shapes, each one cold and silent like ghosts in the air. And they reached the forest near Ember Ridge just before sunrise, and they vanished into the sky like shadows melting into the wind. In his small home, Ray was awake, and his eyes were tired, and his heart was heavy, and he kept checking the cameras he had set around the house, and every sound outside made him hold his breath. And the twins were still asleep in the basement, wrapped in blankets and surrounded by soft light and strange toys that had somehow come from the wreck, and they glowed gently in the dark. Ray stood at the window holding a flashlight and a heavy wrench, and he knew it was not a weapon, but it gave him comfort, and he remembered the two men near the gas station and their cold eyes and fake smiles, and he wondered if they were human at all, and his thoughts were interrupted when the camera near the forest path blinked and turned to static. He rushed to the screen and stared at it, and then the second camera followed, and then the third, and within seconds all screens were black and the system rebooted by itself, and when it came back only one camera was working, and in that frame stood a tall figure wearing black armor and a helmet that covered its face, and the figure turned slowly and looked directly into the lens and raised a hand with 3 fingers, and then the feed cut again. Ray backed away from the screen and grabbed a backpack he had packed days ago, and it had food, water, and a few tools, and he ran down to the basement and gently picked up both twins and placed them in a soft carrier, and they woke up and made soft sounds, and he whispered to them that everything would be fine, and they had to leave now. Outside the trees were silent, and the wind had stopped, and not even a bird made a sound, and Ray moved through the back door and into the woods, staying low and moving fast, and he followed the hidden path he had marked with stones and wires, and after a few minutes he reached an old tunnel that led to the abandoned railway, and he entered it without looking back. At the same time, near the house, 3 hunters moved quietly through the trees, and their steps made no sound, and their eyes glowed red behind the black helmets, and one of them touched the ground near the garage and whispered something in a strange tongue, and a small map appeared in the air showing fresh tracks and energy readings. They followed the trail with sharp movements and perfect coordination, like they were one mind and no human soldier could match their speed or silence, and they reached the house and entered it without using the door, and searched everything in seconds, and they found the broken device shell and the remaining parts of the alien ship, and they found the drawer with the symbol. And the leader touched it, and a low growl came from behind the mask inside the tunnel. Ray kept moving through the dark, and the twins began to make soft humming sounds that echoed off the stone walls, and the lights on their skin began to pulse gently, and the ground under them started to respond, and a faint line of silver light appeared along the tunnel wall and followed them like a guide, and Ray stared at it but did not stop moving. After an hour he reached the other end of the tunnel and stepped out into the morning light, and the sky was still gray, and the air felt strange, and he knew they were not safe yet, and he looked toward the mountains and began walking again, hoping to reach the old cabin his uncle had left him years ago, and it was far and broken, but it was hidden, and that was enough for now. Far above the earth, the main ship received a signal, and the hunter leader spoke in a cold voice, saying the targets have escaped, and the trail is active, and we are in pursuit. And the ship responded with silence, and then opened a new portal and released 3 more scouts toward the blue planet in the town of Ember Ridge. People began to notice strange things like missing pets and silent nights and broken phones, and many thought it was just the weather or bad luck, but a few began to whisper about the light in the sky and the men in black suits who never smiled, and the quiet that came from the forest at night. Ray reached the cabin by sunset, and it was dusty and full of cobwebs, but it had a strong door and dry wood, and he started a small fire and fed the twins, and they laughed for the first time since the crash, and the sound filled the room with warmth, and Ray smiled and sat near them and looked at the stars and felt both fear and hope. Somewhere deep in space another figure woke from sleep and opened old eyes and whispered that the heirs had survived, and the final war was near, and the stars trembled in silence as destiny moved once more. Fire crackled softly, and the cabin smelled of old wood and ash, and Ray sat on the floor watching the twins as they played with glowing stones that had come from the wreck, and their laughter filled the small space, and for a moment everything felt normal and safe and peaceful. But deep inside, Ray knew it was only silence before the storm, and danger was still moving closer. He had locked the cabin from every side and placed broken glass and metal cans near the doors and windows to make noise if anyone came, and he had hidden his truck under branches and leaves and erased his tracks as best as he could, and he had no signal on his phone and no internet, and no idea if the world outside was still the same. Twins began to hum again, and their voices formed a strange melody that echoed across the wooden walls, and one of the stones they held started to float in the air and spin slowly, and Ray watched in awe as symbols appeared in the air like shining letters, and they formed a circle and then vanished, and the stone fell back into their hands, and they both looked at Ray with curious eyes as if waiting for something. Ray stood up and opened the small chest his uncle had kept under the floor, and inside it he found old maps, tools, a photo, and a strange metal piece that looked like a cube with curved edges and a mark on one side that looked exactly like the royal symbol on the alien device, and Ray stared at it for a long time before touching it, and the moment his fingers made contact, it lit up with blue lines and made a soft humming sound. Twins crawled closer and reached for the cube, and the moment they touched it, the walls of the cabin shook slightly, and the fire changed color from orange to white, and a hidden panel opened in the floor, revealing a deep, narrow tunnel filled with cold air and silver light, and Ray stood frozen, not knowing whether to climb down or close it again. He made his choice and tied the twins to his trunk cloth and held the cube in one hand and a flashlight in the other, and stepped into the tunnel, which felt older than the forest itself, and the air smelled of stone and metal and memory, and every step echoed like footsteps in a cave of secrets. The tunnel twisted and turned and led him to a large chamber filled with carvings on the walls and glowing crystals on the ceiling. And in the center stood a pedestal, and around it were more symbols like stars and lines and waves. And Ray stepped forward and placed the cube on the pedestal, and everything changed in an instant. Chamber lit up with colors, and the walls began to move and rearrange, and a voice filled the air, not through sound but through thought, and the voice said, "Welcome, protector of the heirs, your presence has been seen in the stars, and your choices have touched the path of fate, and now you hold the key to the gate of return." Ray looked at the twins, and they looked back without fear, and he realized they understood everything. And they were not just children, they were knowledge and memory and power, and they were waking slowly like a storm rising from calm waters, and he felt small, yet strong just standing beside them. Outside, the hunters had reached the mountains, and they searched every path and every rock and every broken road, and one of them knelt near the old railway and touched the stones and whispered to the wind, and a faint trail appeared glowing red and leading toward the hidden cabin, and without a word the hunters followed it with quiet steps. In the chamber, the pedestal opened and revealed a second object, like a small crown made of silver and light, and it floated into the air and hovered above the twins and slowly lowered onto the head of one of them, and the moment it touched her, the chamber shook, and a beam of light shot up into the sky and vanished through the clouds. Ray covered the twins and grabbed the cube and ran back through the tunnel, and the cabin above was still standing. And nothing had changed on the surface, but in the distance, he could hear a faint hum, and he knew the signal had been seen, and their location was no longer secret. The sky turned darker even though it was day, and a low vibration filled the air like thunder without sound, and birds flew away from the trees, and animals ran into the woods, and a feeling of change moved through everything. And Ray held the twins close and whispered that they had to move again, and this time they had to go farther than ever before. Back in space, a different ship came to life, and inside it sat a figure not of war but of wisdom, and it watched the signal from Earth and whispered that the heirs had found the first gate, and that the lost key had been awakened, and the time of return had begun. The forest was silent as Ray moved quickly through the trees, and the twins were wrapped close to his chest, and their skin shimmered with light that pulsed gently with each breath, and behind them the wind carried a strange sound like a voice calling across the leaves, and Ray did not stop to look back, and he followed the hidden trail that only he remembered from childhood. The air was colder now, and the sky had turned from blue to silver, and strange clouds floated low like giant shadows watching from above, and Ray reached the edge of a deep valley and saw the old watchtower that had not been touched for years, and he stepped inside and closed the heavy door behind him and rested for a moment as the twins hummed softly and their voices filled the room with warmth. He climbed the stairs to the top where the air was thinner and the view stretched far into the distance, and he placed the cube on the floor and waited. And after a few seconds the cube opened again and projected a circle of symbols that floated around them and slowly started spinning, and the twins raised their hands without being told, and the symbols responded to them like petals turning toward the sun. The floor shook slightly, and a second voice appeared in the air, and this time it spoke in the language of thought, not words, and it said, "The heirs have touched the light, and the seal is broken, and the bond has returned, and the protector has stepped into the path of stars, and the gate shall follow." Ray felt a wave of energy passed through him, and for a moment he could see memories that were not his, and stars that had never been charted, and faces that looked like the twins standing in halls of crystal and light, and he saw battles in the sky and fire raining down, and two small forms placed inside a vessel and sent into the void, and then silence fell to his knees and the vision faded, and he gasped for breath as the twins touched his shoulders, and their eyes glowed brighter than ever, and in that moment he understood that they were not just royalty from another world, but the last hope of something ancient and vast and beautiful outside. The hunters had reached the edge of the valley, and they moved without sound, and their armor shimmered to match the colors around them, and they spread in a pattern that covered the forest. And one of them raised a hand and pointed toward the tower, and the others followed without speaking, and without waiting. Inside the tower, Ray saw a mark appear on the floor beneath the twins, and it looked like a star broken into 3 parts, and from that mark came a small orb that floated upward and hovered in front of him, and it showed an image of a place not on any map, a place filled with rings of energy and pillars of glass, and in the center a gate made of pure light. The orb whispered again and said to awaken the gate, the heirs must speak as one, and their names must be known, and the bond must be complete, and the protector must stand between both ends of the lost road. And Ray looked at the twins and asked softly who they were, and for the first time they answered together, and their voices were one, and they said, "We are Orin and Alira of the line of Thaler, and the light remembers us." The tower responded with a deep vibration, and a beam of light shot upward through the roof and vanished into the sky and far above the earth. Another ship turned its course and moved closer, and inside that ship were others who had waited in silence for many years, and they saw the signal and began to speak again for the first time in a long age. Ray picked up the orb and the cube and placed them in his bag and carried the twins back down the tower and stepped outside into the cold air where everything felt sharper and more alive, and he knew now that they were not just hiding anymore. They were moving toward something, and he had a role to play that was older than his name. The hunters were close now, and they moved like shadows bending through the trees, and the one in front stopped and raised its hand, and the others spread out, and a small drone rose into the sky scanning every inch of the land, and within seconds it locked onto the energy trail left by the cube and the orb, and the twin voices and a sharp sound filled the air. As the hunt began, Ray felt the change in the wind and turned toward the mountains and began to run again, and the twins held onto him tighter, and their voices started humming again, but this time it was louder and stronger, and the light from their skin grew in waves, and every step they took left a faint mark in the ground, like stars falling behind them. Somewhere deep in space the original gate stirred, and light cracked through the ancient stone, and the watchers opened their eyes and said, "The awakening has begun, and the balance must be restored, and the lost must return, and the war must end, and the time of silence is over." The wind howled through the mountain pass as Ray moved forward with heavy steps, and the twins were quiet against his chest, their glow soft but steady like distant stars, and every breath he took felt colder and sharper, and the trail ahead was narrow and broken. But he knew there was no turning back, and the light within the twins pulled them onward like a compass made of memory behind them. The sound of the hunters had faded into the shadows, but Ray could feel the pressure in the air and the way the trees seemed to lean away from their path, and he knew the danger was not gone, only waiting for the right moment. And he gripped the orb in one hand and the cube in the other and whispered promises to the sleeping children that he would not fail them. The path ended at a flat cliff that overlooked a valley hidden between the peaks, and at the center of that valley stood something ancient and glowing and alive. And it was not made of stone or metal, but something beyond human understanding, and it shimmered like a rainbow caught in ice, and the shape of it kept changing, like it was breathing. Ray stepped down into the valley, and each step seemed to echo across the land. And the wind stopped moving, and the trees stood still, and even the birds went silent, as if the entire world was holding its breath. And when he reached the edge of the gate, the ground beneath his feet shifted and revealed a circle of light. Twins woke as if called by the heartbeat of the earth, and their eyes opened wide, and they reached for the gate without fear. And their hands glowed brighter, and the gate responded with a low hum that grew louder with each second. And the cube in Ray's hand began to spin slowly and lift into the air. And the orb joined it, and both pieces aligned like parts of a larger Machinia ring of energy formed around them and lifted the twins into the air. And their bodies hovered between the two artifacts, and their voices began to sing in the same strange language Ray had heard in the tower. And this time the ground itself joined the song, and the gate opened in silence. Through the gate, Ray saw a vision of another world filled with golden cities and flying ships and towers of crystal, and people with glowing skin and kind eyes. And in the distance, a great storm moved across the sky with fire and shadows, and behind it, the face of something ancient and cruel. The gate showed him the past, where two royal children were hidden from war and placed in a vessel that crossed galaxies, and the parents stayed behind to protect the kingdom and delay the enemy. And the sacrifice burned through time and space to reach this moment where the heirs stood again before the gate. Ray dropped to his knees as the knowledge poured into his mind like a river through glass. And he saw that his role had been written long before his birth, and that he was chosen not by chance but by the will of the stars. And the bond he shared with the twins was more than love, it was legacy. The twins floated back to the ground, and the cube and the orb returned to Ray's hands, and their glow faded slowly as the gate stayed open and calm and waiting. And Ray asked where it led, and the twins answered not with words, but with touch. And suddenly he knew they had to go through, or the war would find Earth, and everything he loved would fall. At the edge of the valley, the hunters appeared without warning, and their eyes burned with red light, and their weapons were ready, and their steps made no sound, and they moved as one toward the gate. And Ray stood up and placed himself between them and the twins, and his hands trembled, but his heart was steady. The twins stepped beside him and raised their arms, and the air around them shifted like bending light, and a shield formed in front of them, made not of force but of memory and promise. And the hunters fired without hesitation, and the energy blasts hit the shield and vanished like dust in the wind. One hunter broke formation and charged forward, and Ray met it head-on with the cube raised high, and the cube responded with a wave of sound that knocked the creature back into the ground and left a mark that smoked and hissed. And the rest of the hunters paused as if uncertain for the first time. The gate behind them grew brighter, and a voice echoed across the valley, not from above, but from within, and it said, "The path is open, the heirs have returned, and the balance must be restored, and the light shall not fall again." And the air vibrated with ancient power as more gates began to appear across the sky. Ray turned to the twins and nodded, and they stepped through the light hand in hand, and he followed close behind. And as they crossed the threshold, the world shifted, and time bent, and the stars turned, and they vanished into the gate, and the valley fell silent again as the light faded like morning mist under rising sun. The light faded slowly, and Ray opened his eyes to find himself standing on a vast plain of glowing grass, and endless sky and towers of light reached toward the heavens, and around him the air shimmered with energy and sound that felt like music. And the twins stood beside him, calm and silent, and glowing brighter than ever. They had crossed through the gate and entered the world from where the twins had come, and it was not broken as Ray feared, but it was sleeping and waiting for something to wake it, and the moment they arrived, the world began to stir like a heart remembering how to beat again, and light flowed from the ground like rivers through glass. A great structure rose ahead, shaped like a star turned inside out, and it pulsed with the same symbol Ray had seen on the cube and the orb, and the moment they stepped toward it, the path opened with golden light, and voices whispered through the air, welcoming the return of the lost blood and the protector who carried them home. Ray walked slowly with the twins toward the heart of the city, and at each step more of the land awakened, and machines began to move, and lights came alive in the towers, and statues turned their heads and watched with eyes full of time and memory and sorrow. At the center of the city stood the Hall of Echoes, where all royal voices lived, and when the twins stepped inside, the walls lit up with 1,000 lights, and a beam of energy rose from the floor and touched their foreheads, and symbols appeared around them like stars reborn, and they spoke their names in the ancient tongue, and the hall accepted them. Ray stood behind them, silent and unsure of his place, and yet the hall did not ignore him, and a path opened to him, made of light and sound, and he followed it to a chamber filled with mirrors, and in those mirrors he saw his past, his fears, his pain, and his strength, and a voice told him that his choices had rewritten fate, and that no bloodline, no crown, no legacy was greater than the will to protect. Outside, the sky turned dark without warning, and thunder rolled without sound, and through the clouds came ships of black fire and burning steel, and the enemy had followed them across the gate, and the final battle had begun before the city was ready. Ray rushed to the outer wall with the twins, and saw the black ships descend, and from them came shapes like shadows, with blades of red light and voices that burned through the air, and they moved with fury and silence, and nothing stood before them as they landed. But this world was not alone, and from the towers came guardians of old, made of crystal and storm and fire, and they rose with a roar and clashed with the enemy, and the sky turned into fire and thunder and light. Twins raised their hands, and a wave of energy spread from them, and the ground lit up, and a shield formed around the city. But the shield was not strong enough, and the enemy began to break through, and one ship crashed near the wall, and from it stepped the leader of the dark host with armor made of screams and eyes like dying suns. Ray stepped forward without fear and raised the cube, and the orb and the light from them pushed back the shadows and gave the twins the strength to rise into the air and speak the words of awakening, and the gate behind them reopened, and from it came others who had waited in silence. Beyond time, allies of the royal blood came riding ships made of silver and fire, and they joined the battle, and the tide began to turn, and the city fought like a living force. And Ray stood in the center holding the last piece of the key, and the twins touched his shoulders, and the final seal broke. A light rose into the sky and reached into the stars, and the enemy screamed and began to fall, and the darkness cracked, and the leader of the host charged toward the center, and Ray met him with nothing but will and heart and fire, and the cube burned in his hands as he stood between the enemy and the heirs. Impact shook the world, and a wave of energy spread across the sky in silence, followed like the breath after a storm, and the shadows vanished, and the ships turned to dust, and the light returned. Ray opened his eyes and saw the twins smiling, and the city whole and alive, and the gate closed behind them, and the balance was restored, and the final stand had passed into legend. In the days that followed, Ray stood not as a stranger, but as a protector of two worlds, and the twins ruled with wisdom. And light and peace returned, not just to one place, but to many, and across stars and skies. The story of the lost heirs and the man who stood with them was told, and remembered, not for power or glory or war, but for love.